Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the latest installment of Mazzetti's Bending the Climate Curve lecture series. My name is John Utek. I'm the Senior Director of Sustainability Strategy and Finance at Mazzetti, an employee-owned benefit corporation where bending the climate curve is our mission. As a reminder, these sessions are recorded and available on demand via our website, mazzetti.com, under Resources. We built quite a library of fascinating speakers and topics, so please visit. There's a lot to learn and you'll get a lot from visiting. This series was created to bring together leaders who are helping healthcare organizations navigate some of the most important challenges of our time, translating climate strategy into real operational, clinical, and infrastructure outcomes. We're grateful to have all of you joining us today across healthcare and the sustainability community. So today, you all are lucky because we have a great speaker. We're going to explore building a climate-ready health system, infrastructure, supply chain, and clinical solutions. Jason Fischer will examine how health systems can apply climate strategies in infrastructure, supply chain, and clinical care for effective results. Drawing on real-world experience, we'll highlight the high-impact levers for decarbonization, examining how building design and energy systems influence clinical outcomes and resiliency, and share practical approaches to engaging physicians and vendors. Jason Fischer is a Texas Tech University graduate with a background in organizational leadership and nonprofit support. After a stem cell transplant and recovery from bone marrow failure, he transitioned into healthcare leadership. Since joining Houston Methodist the Woodlands Hospital in 2017, Jason established environmental services, launched patient transportation, and helped form a system-wide EVS Council of Directors, driving a 20% reduction in linen usage and achieving 90th percentile in HCAP cleanliness, which is quite an achievement. Having been in a hospital system myself, those are difficult measures to hit. In 2023, Jason became the inaugural System Director of the Office of Sustainability at the Houston Methodist Research Institute, aligning system-wide sustainability strategy through innovation and conservation. His work includes emissions tracking deployment, the first solar array for Texas Medical Center, a medical PVC recycling program, and he co-develops a recycling hospital playbook with the Healthcare Plastics Recycling Council, where he serves on the Hospital Facilities Advisory Board. He also supports the office's broad pillars across clinical sustainability, environmental health and prevention, and the Center for Health and Nature, which is a partnership with Texas A&M. We have some really important learning objectives today. I'm excited to learn about all of these things through Jason's talk today. Infrastructure, supply chain, clinical practice, and health outcomes. So for those of you who are interested in getting credit for today's session, there's a bit of housekeeping. Today's event does qualify for one AIA CEU. If you didn't provide your AIA number before registering, please send it to info@mazzetti.com. We'll hold questions till after Jason is done speaking, but you are encouraged to ask questions at any time during the presentation via the Q&A function on the webinar, which I'll be monitoring. Today's session is being recorded. The recording will be shared along with a copy of the slides to all attendees. With no further ado, I'm going to give the talking baton over to Jason. So Jason, looking forward to your talk.
Great. Thank you so much, John. Yeah. Thank you, John, and thank you, Mazzetti, for having me here this morning, and excited to share with you our journey at Houston Methodist, and hopefully we can provide some support and direction and insight as you are all on your own journeys and bending the climate curve. So let me go ahead and share my screen here with you. One moment. All right, excellent. So I want to kick off today to discuss a couple definitions, and this is something that we revisit and I hear consistently across the realm of sustainability is what is the definition of sustainability and how does that differ from resilience? And so when we look at sustainability at Houston Methodist, we look at this as the responsible use of resources to protect the environment and support health and well-being. And so we very much see this as a function of preparation and adaptation. But this is just a smaller piece of a larger umbrella when we look at resilience, which is the capacity to anticipate, prepare for, adapt to, and recover from disruption or change in ways that preserve care delivery, protect people, and strengthen the health system over time. So sustainability is very much a component of resilience and resiliency. And so when we think about resilience and sustainability at Houston Methodist, we really looked at, well, is this a micro or macro view? How are we really applying this to the work that we do in the communities we serve? And ultimately, we really want to focus in on hyper-local thinking. How can we think hyper-local and how can we scale that? How can we have scalable impact across our entities, but also across the communities that we serve? And so when we think about this from a lens of resilience, there were some things that we wanted to take into account. And I want to ask the people who are with us today, if you wouldn't mind sharing in this survey with me. This is a Menti, and I'll give you a minute to get started. There's a little QR code and number there. But I'm curious, true or false? I know someone impacted by a natural disaster. Let's see, we have 7 respondents, 6 true, 1 false. Excellent. All right. Well, I see a majority, an overwhelming majority. Yes, there's been an impact from a natural disaster. Someone that you know has been impacted. And this is very much a lens that we utilize at Houston Methodist. And to show a little bit of our history here and the why behind what we do, I want to dive in and go back to 2001. June 2001, Houston was struck with Tropical Storm Allison, which sat over Houston for hours, drenching and dropping rain over a 5-day period, 35 inches of rain. And it impacted so many lives across the greater Houston area. But one of the maybe lesser known facts about this is the impact that it had on the Texas Medical Center and the flooding in the basements and the operational interruption, and resulted in so many different deployments of initiatives to help reduce that in the future. How are we adapting to those changes and making sure we remain resilient? Another one is later in August of 2017, which dropped over 60 inches of rain. This was a huge impact across the greater Houston region and the Gulf of Texas. And when we look at the impact, economic and life loss, and the interruption to day-to-day operations, this is another key moment that we often reflect on in sustainability. Looking at Houston and its long history of flooding, you may or may not be aware of our positioning in Texas and our climate here. We also deal with a lot of high heat and air quality opportunities. And so this is some work that's been done internally looking at how air quality amplifies the impact of high heat ER admissions. And is a discussion of how we can change our thoughts and perceptions and insight into our climate and how it impacts. This work was done by Dr. Coral Lozado. We'll talk a little bit more about here shortly as well. But looking at this, we really want to frame this as everything we do, how does it kind of circle back to this thought of resilience? And looking at that from a hyper local perspective, how are we preparing for future adversity? And so when we look at infrastructure and resilience in particular, I want to look at some of our systems and resiliency planning and how that impacts carbon reduction and continuity of care in our hospitals. And so a couple more questions here. I'm curious, is anyone currently, those that are in healthcare, tracking your purchased energy, gas, or water? We've got 1, 2, 9 respondents. We'll see if those pop up. So 3 yes, 1 no. Okay, great. Give it a minute to populate here. So I want to ask one more question in relation to this. So we're at 5 yes and 1 no. Okay. I'm going to move on to the next question. Are you currently measuring any scopes of emissions at your organization? And so if you're not sure what scopes are, you can put unsure on there, but just curious how everyone is currently interacting with emissions. Got 3 yes, 4 yes, 1 unsure. 5 yes, 1 unsure. Okay, excellent. So when we look at Houston Methodist, I want to share kind of our journey on our greenhouse gas accounting, our emissions accounting. So 2024 is one of our baseline years, and this was done internally utilizing Net Zero Cloud. And you can see that these are unvalidated estimates, and that it tells a fairly good picture of what we're doing as a hospital system. But when we look at measuring our emissions, this is something that helps us to understand what we can do or what we need to do to reduce our impact. And so if you can't measure it, you can't reduce it. And so that's been the first piece of our work in sustainability, trying to measure that to get better insight into the data of what's possible, where the barriers are, and where the opportunities are. And so with this, we expanded upon this, and I want to highlight specifically scope 2, looking at your purchased electricity, steam, heat, and cooling as a big piece of this when we look at your infrastructure. And so you can see we're at 130,000 metric tons of carbon equivalent. And then we decided to go on a journey to validate that information, which has been an extremely important part of our process. We partnered with a third-party consulting firm to review our scopes 1 and 2 footprint and to validate it to the greenhouse gas protocols. And so you can see with our validation, there was an increase across our scopes 1 and 2, and specifically our scope 2. So it really shows that importance of having that third-party validation. Our scope 3 validation is not complete at this time. That's something that is a little bit more of to bite off, and we'll talk about that supply chain aspect here shortly. When we look at this, we want to determine how are we impacting, or how is this helping us in our energy facilities and design planning. And there's a wide range of ways that we can do this. We have outage tracking, energy audits, looking at wholesale energy and microgrid solutions. And so when we look at this data, we're able to really analyze from an outage perspective, whether it's a grid opportunity or whether it was a weather event that was related to the outage, and helps us to better plan for the future as we grow. When we look at energy audits, this is something that helps us to determine where we're at right now and how we can reduce. I think the best analogy I've heard is before you buy the custom suit, you want to make sure that you're losing the weight. And so that's what our energy audits and having this information really allows us to do. We can determine where we're at, how much we can reduce on site, and then determine what do we need to do from a wholesale energy perspective. If we reduced as much as we can through energy efficiency, what do we need to do for wholesale energy? And then also from a microgrids perspective, how do we implement the right-sized microgrids so we're not overbuilding and overspending for those solutions on our campuses? And all of this is aimed at, it has a financial return on investment, but also it has that emissions return on investment, how we're reducing that impact downstream on the communities that we serve. And so you might be wondering, well, how do we justify this? And I like to refer to the World Resources Institute study that shows climate adaptation investments yield a $10 for every dollar spent in investment for climate adaptation. And so a lot of this is not necessarily going to be realized up front. When you think about sustainability, it's a long-term impact. It's a planning spend and planning investment from a sustainability and resilience perspective. And so what I would advise is really looking at an opportunity to go from pilots to progress. And so this is an example of our Josie Roberts Administration building in the Texas Medical Center. And we were building a new parking garage and had the opportunity to deploy solar to this location. And we decided to pursue this, and we had a go live of September 2024. We decided to sell excess back to the grid as it was available. And what we found was, this is a great signal to the community. It does have a return on investment. It may not have the investment return that a lot of financial executives are looking for, but we're able to garner that support to look at this as a long-term investment in sustainability and for future planning. And so when we look at this, we were able to learn a lot about the cost, the process, and just engaging our suppliers and our vendors, construction design vendors, of thinking about this outside of the box for future builds. And so as a result of this, we're now future-proofing our parking garage rooftops and other locations to make sure that it's ready for solar in the future. And in the Houston area, we are, whether good or bad, positioned at a place for low-cost energy. But we don't anticipate that that's going to be a constant, as we can see changes already being impacted from a geopolitical perspective. And so how do we remain ready for that future so we're not scrambling to catch up? This has also led to a discussion around microgrids and how are we utilizing or exploring new technologies that are available to be future ready, to be ready to serve the community and those times of needs during those disasters, during those high heat days in which we see an increase in demand. We want to make sure that we remain functional throughout those events. So with all of that, there's an opportunity for a reduction of our carbon emissions and our downstream and impact on our communities, but that's not going to be 100% of the mitigation of our emissions. And what I like to refer to as the last mile emission offsets. And this is something that we're in early stages of exploring. I also think it's one of the most exciting areas to pursue. And so with that, to achieve the last mile of offsets, we can look at renewable energy credits and energy attribute certifications. And then also the other piece of that, my favorite part, is the hyperlocal emission credit projects. And so when you think about these projects, this is something that look at what you can do at your campuses that can mitigate and reduce, whether it's a new build or a retro commission on your campus. And when we look at the opportunities, we really want to review what are the heat island effects of the facilities that we're building and the parking lots that we're preparing on site. And do we have an opportunity to introduce more pocket forests and prairies to help mitigate some of that island effect? So for our visitors, our patients, but also our surrounding communities, how are we helping and avoiding contribution to the growing problems? The other piece of that is stormwater flooding. So how do we look at bioswales and deployment of bioswales to help with stormwater runoff? In Houston, as we know, these two are a big opportunity for us from a climate change perspective. And so with that, there's also that opportunity for deploying these and looking at a further further credit for mitigation of emissions. I think that one of the things we want to do, and one of the things we're exploring, we'll talk more about in the community aspect, is how do we not only learn from this at our campuses, but how do we invest in this in our communities and find those low-hanging opportunities to expand out and investing hyper local to not only mitigate the effects of climate change that we're experiencing, but also doing so where it can reduce our emissions footprint and really developing a resilient greater Houston area. So when we look at our supply chain and vendor engagement, I really want to look at how do you determine the areas of opportunity to focus your time. When we look at supply chain as emissions within healthcare, supply chain or scope 3 emissions, which is a significant piece of that is supply chain, 80% of healthcare emissions are scope 3. And when you dig in a little bit further, when you look at scope 3 emissions specifically, at least at our organization, 80% of our scope 3 emissions comes from 20% of our vendors. So as you're going out and you're mapping this, it can be enticing to get caught up in mapping and categorizing every single vendor. I know we have thousands of vendors, and the feasibility of that is just low and not a lot of return on investment. So focusing on that 80-20 rule, what are your top 20% of high purchasers or high spend vendors? Those are going to be the highest amount of emissions, and that's a great place to start to tackle, and even taking a little chunk of that to look at how you're reducing in those areas. But even then, it can be daunting to determine, well, how do I dig in and really even choose from those organizations? And this is where the layers of information and why developing systems for tracking your emissions and having this data allows you to look at things from different perspectives. And so before we go on to kind of a little further discussion in that, I'm curious, I want to hear from the group, approximately how many gloves do you think that Houston Methodist uses across its 9 hospitals and physician organization in a single year? You know, the first option is 100,000 to 999,000. Second option is 1 million to 999,999,000. The other is 10 million to 100 million. The other is 100 million and above. Let's see, we have several in the million to 10 million, several in the 10 million to 100 million, and 2 in the 3 in the 100 million plus. 12, 15 responses. 12. All right. So I'll go ahead and reveal this. So this is really interesting. I always love seeing the responses to this question and the response afterwards. When you look at Houston Methodist, across our system, we use over 144 million gloves. So you're looking at 200,000 pairs a day, 845,000 pounds a year, with a difficult reduction opportunity. So disposal equates to methane carbon equivalents, and the contamination from the use of the gloves makes it difficult to recycle that and the materials that make those up as well. So I really encourage you to think about, when you're looking from your supply and supply reduction from a carbon emissions perspective, think of it along this continuum of waste, recycling, and vendor engagement. And so when we look at these and how these all interrelate, we look at how are we going and determining a pathway for recycling and diversion from waste pathways. And then also, how are we expanding upon the recyclability of the specific materials? So when we look at materials and end-of-life compatibility, and working with the Healthcare Plastic Recycling Council and our pilot here in Houston, we've found so many barriers to recycling. A lot of those has been in plastic packaging, looking at empty saline flushes, and medical PVC. And I highlight the medical PVC project specifically because it's been a great success in working with Westlake Dimex to recycle and capture some of the materials. But we've also found a lot of opportunities, and how do we make this seamless for our clinicians to participate? They're so motivated, but we ask so much of them from day to day. So how are we making and developing systems that makes the participation and the barriers to participation extremely low? And so we've found some ways to do that with the medical PVC project, but there's a lot more opportunities to make sure we're not getting cross-contaminated. I'd say cross-contaminated from a multi-polymer perspective. So for example, IV bags that have a rubber connector on that, a rubber port, those have to be manually cut off to make sure that they're not getting mixed into the recycling process. And the process can take a small amount of those, but if you get too much, then it interrupts the whole process and makes the recycling batch ineffective. And so we use this to think about how we're engaging from our purchased items perspective. And so when we look at across all the items that we purchase as a healthcare system, determining what are the top 15 items that have a potential for recycling, and what do those plastic materials look like, or what are the barriers to having those items recycled. And so we want to use that as an engagement with our vendors, and we have a couple great conversations ongoing at looking at what are the items and is there any potential for a redesign. And we really need healthcare as a whole to really get on board with this and support one another, because it's not just a one hospital opportunity. This is something that we as a voice of healthcare need to provide to our suppliers to show that we're serious and interested in this for them to make their investments. And rightly so. Ultimately, they have the same charge in ensuring financial viability for their organizations as well. And so this is an example of some work that one of our interns did to categorize some of our top purchased items and used items and the types of plastics associated with those. When we look at sustainability as a whole from a supply chain perspective, it's really about engagement, as is really sustainability as a whole: engagement, education, piloting to dream big and explore those opportunities. So when we look at leading and resilience together with our supply chain, one of the things that we want to look is what is the total cost of ownership for the items. So that's packaging, disposal cost and labor, product design, clinical waste volumes, logistics from freight, emissions, and resilience, and energy and water, and the embedded cost in the products. And when you think about this, and going back to the recyclability, there has been a lot of great work that our manufacturers have done and resin producers have done with manufacturers. There's less packaging, that's lower, resulting in lower shipping costs, lower storage costs, waste hauling costs, and there's been a lot of work done to right-size kits or eliminate double packaging. So we want to optimize for packaging reduction, and that's been a really great process to date. But it's also had some unintended consequences with that. Getting to mass material for recycling, the amount of materials needed for a viable, economically viable recycling program is one of those big barriers. So how do we pursue optimization of material recovery? And that goes back to that vendor engagement. How are we providing the feedback of, we want to recycle these IV bags, but here are the barrier items. What are the opportunities in a redesign for these, and how can we think through some redesign in these areas to make it optimized for that material recovery? And so another way that we're engaging with supply chain and suppliers is looking at what does our agreement language include. And so we are exploring what type of language for a standard sustainability expectation are we providing to our vendors. And what are we looking at from a preferred sustainability partner, having more nuanced information or detail into the supplies that are brought to us, whether it's details on polymers that are used in each product or its packaging or the weighting, so we can aggregate and determine the best end of market, downstream market for these items and planning ahead of time. And then the last is strategic sustainability partners. Who is stepping up to the plate to talk about those designs, bringing in their engineers to really understand the problems with the recyclability and material recovery opportunities. And all of this, to wrap up from a sustainability perspective, there's a lot of other opportunities out there and avenues. Vizient has their preferred purchasing dashboard, which is great to look at the characteristics of the items that you're purchasing and how you're reducing. We're pursuing this, but it's a lot more involved with our governance structure. And so with that, the vast structure and implementation across the system, we are looking at this from a language perspective as a quicker insight into data and quicker insight into how we're reducing from a downstream perspective. Looking at our climate strategy and clinical practice, this is Dr. Faisal Masood, our medical director of sustainability, who has been a champion in educating our physicians and developing programs that really focus on clinical care delivery for environmentally informed clinical decision making. And I want to highlight just a few of the things and thinking about sustainability and sustainable care and delivery of care. Dr. Masood has long been a proponent of virtual care and has established a virtual ICU network across our hospital systems, manages a virtual discharge nurse program, has established a virtual advanced practice provider connection, and also supports, when we look at a system, we support a virtual urgent care. And all of these are aimed at not just care delivery, but actually helps reduce our footprint and also supports from a resiliency perspective. How are we managing our people resources and ensuring that we're providing the best expertise, whether from our APPs or physicians, in the right place at the right time, while reducing the demand and burnout for them and their daily schedules. So increasing efficiency while also increasing job satisfaction across multiple positions. When you look at care delivery from a clinical operations perspective, these are what I would guess you would refer to the usual suspects in sustainability healthcare. Looking at anesthetic gas reduction, supply waste management, medication waste reduction, your oxygen management, lab orders reduction, and pack standardization. Some of these easier than others, but all being driven by Dr. Masood and our Green ICU movement and countless other of proponents in our physician groups across Houston Methodist. Thinking about care delivery from a different perspective, I want to shift gears and recognize Dr. Hina Faisal, who was awarded an NIH grant to test virtual reality for ICU delirium. And the initial results are looking extremely promising. And there's an expansion to look at this from a wide range of other uses within the hospital system. And so thinking about virtual healing and this care delivery model of reducing adverse outcomes and improving health outcomes, specifically in our ICU in this specific example. We also have our Center for Health and Nature. That is another aspect of how are we introducing medicine as nature as medicine. And when you look at exercising in nature has a 10-time multiplier on the health impacts, physiological health impacts when you're actually in nature. And even just having visuals of nature in a gym or otherwise still has an increased impact on that outcome. And last, we have Dr. Al-Kindi and his climate care. Dr. Al-Kindi is with our DeBakey Heart and Vascular Center and really focuses on environmental health and prevention. He's a preventative cardiologist is his background. And he is really looking from a perspective of how do we identify at-risk groups? How do we integrate climate assessments into our clinics? And how are we providing patient environmental education and prevention education from the physician organization and providing that to help to increase the stability of our operations from our ERs, but also the stability in individuals' homes and those that are suffering from specific diseases that are at risk in certain natures, whether high heat or air quality or otherwise. Last, I want to talk about a little bit about environment and community. And this is Dr. Cora Lozada, and she really focuses on how environmental exposures impact patient health and design strategies that position health systems as leaders in preventative health and community engagement. And that key piece being community engagement. And so when you look at developing your climate action plan, where do you start as an organization? And a lot of times it's tempting to build from the ground up and build something new or reinvent the wheel. And we were actually able to, with the help of Dr. Lozada, take a look at a regional perspective of what is the city of Houston doing from a climate action plan perspective? What is Houston Galveston Area Council of Governments pursuing? And what is the state of Texas supporting from grants perspective? And there's a lot of support and a lot of literature and guidance that's out there today. And so how do we align with that, not just to maximize the impact at Houston Methodist, but impact regionally for Houston, for the greater Houston area? And some other resources that we're using in that climate action planning is looking at ISO 9001 and their climate assessments, a Joint Commission sustainability certificate, and of course, practice green health reporting, and making sure that as we're building this, we're not building out multiple modalities that we have to keep up across various realms. How do we collect it all in one location to get the information to the right place while also aligning across the system and our region? And our community benefits, another key partner in the development of our climate strategy at Houston Methodist. They've long worked with nature-based organizations, food resiliency, and other organizations that really have a key aspect in environment of care. But we're looking to expand that. So community engagement, we're expanding to look at a lot of the large organizations across the US, whether it's Practice Green Health, Healthcare Without Harm, National Academy of Medicine. And then also, Dr. Lozada has been doing a lot of great work to develop new and expand new environmental community engagement opportunities. So Citizens Environmental Coalition has a long-running community engagement, over 40 years in existence. Friends of Columbia TAP, Madres del Parque, and Black United Fund that was established in the 1960s as well, all focusing on that environmental aspect. So again, not looking to reinvent the wheel, but how do we break down silos and how do we support what's already there and understand the needs of the community to best serve them, especially from a climate action and climate resiliency perspective. And so when you look at that, a lot of what is being taken into account there is focused on environmental determinants of health. So water quality, air quality, soil quality, again, extreme heat and flooding, access to nature, and then healthcare facilities. Not your traditional healthcare facility, but looking at basic needs from energy, waste, and water. And all of these are the perfect opportunity to engage with your communities, to understand and meet them where they're at and what their immediate needs are for the future. Thank you so much. I want to thank you, John, and want to open up to any questions from the group.
Thank you so much, Jason. Wow, what an impressive set of operational impacts, design changes, and clinical integration for sustainability. That's really amazing, Jason. So for participants, please feel free to put your questions in the chat. I've had a few come through, but we have some time now to engage in a discussion about the information that Jason has shared. So I'm monitoring the chat here. I have a few questions that have come through. And my first one relates really, Jason, in your background. One thing that stands out based on your presentation is how really good sustainability work aligns with operational improvement and quality. You've run business units in hospital systems. How's that framing work for you, and in terms of clinical, operational sustainability and operational performance and outcomes within Houston Methodist? Is that something that resonates with caregivers?
Yeah, it is. When we announced our sustainability initiative in 2023, our
Mm,
system CEO, Dr. Mark Boom, sent out his president's letter to talk about the work that we would be doing. And it had
yeah,
the largest response from our physician group ever that we've seen to
really?
one of his letters. Yes.
Oh my God.
Yeah, yeah. So the appetite is there, and getting to hear the feedback and interact with, especially from our physicians, there has been a long awaited response to this and a passion for it. And so we're finding that the buy-in is there. Of course, it's not everyone. Everyone had there's different groups and different
Sure.
operational focuses. But ultimately, when we come in and start with the why, it becomes an easy sell. I think the key thing for us is, looking at the process flow and making sure that we're not overburdening our clinicians to provide the care. And ultimately, I think there's a connection between that sustainability initiatives and care and looking at quality and outcomes. And it shows that dedication to performance improvement, continuous improvement, but really that team model of how are we building this together to build the buy-in.
It's incredible, Jason. So clearly people were waiting and they saw the signal and they're sort of jumping in. And then it's like, hey, Jason, here you go. Here's the steering wheel. So I was at
Yes.
the Cleveland Clinic for more than a decade, a physician-run hospital system. And that can be it's certainly a wonderful boon. It is also a challenge. So you highlighted a couple real successes about, green the ICU and these clinical things. you know, what's the resource you have? How do you pick and choose between these different things? Because having all that interest suddenly, doctors are busy and they have a full practice that they have to do and all kinds of demands that upon them. How is that something that you manage as a director without infinite resources? I imagine to engage with people. How do you make choices? What's been your guiding principles along those lines, Jason?
Yeah, yeah. I know that's one of the things that I feel like we feel it out every day. But when we look at it, we want to look and make sure, do you have a strong champion that's going to
Mm,
help to be able to align and move it forward? Without that buy-in and that champion, things can stagnate. And so making
yeah.
sure that you have the strong champion and the clear ask. And so we're implementing an intake process for whether it's for data or research or project support, and how do we bring those requests in and evaluate as a team what's possible, what's not possible, what aligns with our ultimate goals. And a lot of this is in looking at that climate action plan, looking at how are we getting the entities to be the ones who are leading this. And so it gets to be a lot where we're doing a lot of the work. And so how do we do more education and
Right.
provide them with from a consulting perspective and support perspective to give them the tools, whether it's the climate action plan at an entity level and walking them through that to where they're setting their own goals, achievable goals that we can then support them as they champion them at an individual level.
That's great. That's great. And your system is now involved in a number of industry-wide collaborations. It's this interesting conflicts between it. Hey, I have this plastic part, Jason, help me recycle this. And really it can be a systems problem too. So you have to sort of bridge that individual action versus collective. You certainly shared some great stories about that. How do how essential do you see industry collaboration? And you shared a number of the groups that you're involved with, the Healthcare Plastic Recycling Council, Vizient. There are these industry-wide groups. Are there new and emerging things that you're thinking about? And now more than ever, I think, given the times we're in, I think this kind of group work is important. Um, uh, are there and I also love it, by the way, when I graduated college, the 80/20 rule is one of the first things that's true, right? So it's really a
Right,
small
right.
number of vendors that are driving a lot of your emissions. Any color commentary on the receptivity of those vendors? Some of them have more, higher profit margins than hospitals. How's that been working with some of those vendors? One of those discussions.
Yeah, yeah.
What's some of the shape of that?
It's been mixed. It's interesting to get, in I guess in your day-to-day account representatives with the vendors, we did a show of hands how many were familiar with sustainability initiatives at their organizations, and there were very few that were familiar with their own organization's sustainability projects. And so
Interesting.
it was interesting to hear the ones that were the type of work they were doing and how that kind of lit the room as far as igniting the conversation with each other and wanting to learn more about their individual projects and what they're pursuing. And so I think it's been a positive. I think there's still a lot of work. And I think that goes back to, as we're making these asks from a contracting perspective, starts to bring more visibility to that healthcare is here. We're exploring this and we're serious about it. So looking to get that response and that buy-in from the supplier community.
Gotcha. Okay. Here's a technical question that's come in. You mentioned your scope 1, 2, and 3 and your initial calculation, and now you're going back and sort of getting some assurance about the validity and the calculation methods, all the lovely gridding, blocking, and tackling about data and factors and activity assumptions and things. I don't. What was it? Just your own desire for accuracy? What spurred you to sort of go down that path? I'm not sure that's something that that level of rigor I think is admirable. What's the origin story of sort of going through that? Because that probably is costing some money and time and resource. But tell us a little bit more color commentary on that, please.
Yeah, when we look at kind of the landscape of the White House voluntary reduction for the 2030 to 2050, we looked at that and we said, well, this is great, but if we're going to go that direction, what do we know? What do we not know? And so there was just so much that we didn't know, especially from a missions perspective. And so how do we prepare for that landscape? And how do we understand what is feasible from a cost and from a employee buy-in and participation in the program? And so we were fortunate to have that support from our executive team down as let's measure what we don't know, and then let's be able to make those decisions and what we can reduce. And so we're still a lot in that fact gathering. I feel really positive about the direction and the support that we could get with that. And I think it's just a matter of laying out the full map. How do you get the team to understand the roadmap of where we are and where we can go, and making sure that we're not setting future leaders up for failure.
That's great, Jason. Now, one more question that's come through. So you talked about future proofing, which I love that. That's a beautiful concept. And if I'm remembering correctly, 35 inches and 60 inches of rainfall or something, these dramatic weather events, which certainly just seem to be getting more frequent and more intense. And so that certainly gives a great context for the work. But then there's the brass tacks of how do we take that abstract idea into funded reality? So, you're really still in the early days of putting this together. How are from a funding this work standpoint in terms of decisions on projects, be they renovations or new projects, just how's that taking shape? You're, early days, but, how is finance on board, and kind of what kind of, mechanisms are you guys employing to sort of help? Because I've heard the first cost thing, it occasionally comes up in hospitals, and with pressure on margins and revenue, it's probably more difficult than ever. So what's that look like in your system?
Yeah, absolutely. When we look at that, ROI is a big important piece for us in our finance team. I think you have a little more flexibility from an operations perspective at a local entity level, and so getting their buy-in and support can get easier to get a foot in the door and show the progress of a pilot at a small level, and then being able to scale that out. One of the things that we've looked at is really staying within the margins. So is it a plus minus 5%? When you look at long term and how we're bending our climate curve, looking at some of these third-party vendors that can help us analyze what the reduction strategy is. So finding those high return on investment opportunities that can help to pay for those low return on investment opportunities. And so I think that's the real strategy there, is how are you bundling together? And so with that, one of the things that we're pursuing is looking at a green revolving fund, and how are we taking our demand response savings and savings from retrofitting from incandescent to LED lights and reinvesting that into initiatives that are already there. The other piece that, and this is one of the things that I'm continuing to refine, is looking at, from a value analysis, looking at risk adjusted value, strategic value, your systems level value, like what insight to data at a system level are you reaching. So for example, our anesthetic gases, we're able to find information about what's being purchased where, what's not being streamlined, and how can we get everyone on page from a systemness perspective.
Wow, that's great, Jason. Yeah, that's really, really important what you just said. That's the systemness thing. And one final question just for me, because I know you're in Texas, and I think power in much of Texas, can be more affordable. There's also more renewable energy than in some parts of the country. But you kind of have this wildly variable energy market, and Houston specifically is a big energy hub, and you're kind of in this energy area, and we're in this time when interest in data centers is exploding, and there's all this potential increase in demand. Is that something, how are you navigating some of those discussions around the return? You mentioned, I think what you're saying is really smart. Let's look for the high return stuff, which tends to lead to, shorter payback stuff where you don't need to maybe go out 5 or 10 years, but you're making investments in solar. How are you navigating some of the future pricing of energy and RECs and things like that as you're sort of thinking about solutions for these problems?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. When we look at Texas, the data warehousing, I believe Texas is on its way to being the data warehouse capital of
I
the
think
world.
so, right? Yeah.
Yes, yeah, which is terrifying from a grid resiliency perspective. So we're watching a lot of the legislation that's coming out of Austin here, and determining how these organizations are going to be managed and what the expectations are going to be from a grid resiliency perspective. And that may have unintended consequences on our demand response programs as well. So when we look at this, I think microgrids become a lot more attractive, and there's a lot of great work coming out of Rice's Baker Institute on public policy, and looking at, from an energy perspective, having it more localized through microgrids for better resiliency. And so something we're continuing to evaluate, and then looking at renewables, and having a good wholesale partner to help you navigate some of those concepts is extremely important. So like renewables, renewable energy credits versus the attribute credits. So are you looking for purely solar and wind, or are you okay with nuclear as an option with that, and trying to decide what's the best benefit for you, and then how does that also impact your region, the viability of your region.
Great. Yeah, that's the fun of sustainability, is we get to try to integrate all these things which involve changing human beings, changing building systems, and then forecasting future energy markets. That's why there's never a dull moment, Jason. It's why it's been so great to have you share these success stories. I think we've gone through the questions from our guests. Thank you, everyone who showed up today for Jason's talk. One final, if anyone has a question they want to put in the chat, I'll ask it. If not, I think what I'm going to do is transition to thanking Jason so much for your great talk today. Thanks to everyone, all the participants who were able to join us and listen to this message. I'm now going to take the screen and share that we have a bend in the climate curve teed up for June, which is June the 23rd, at the same time, same channel. The name of the topic is One Health, and it's Dr. Coral Lozada, also from Houston Methodist. She is a faculty fellow researcher. So we look forward to learning more about all the great work taking place down in Houston. I think, Jason, right at the beginning of the hottest and most humid weather that you guys experience, which is June, July, and August, right? So
yes,
we'll be testing all the building energy systems of your medical center and hearing more about the topic of One Health in June. But thanks again, Jason, for this great talk and continued success in all your work down there. And thanks everyone for showing up. And with that, I will release you all to get back to your day. Thanks again. Take care, all.
Thanks, John. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, bye-bye.